He was definitely not that. In fact, let's notice what we find in Exodus 2, 11 and 12. Before he spent those 40 years in Midian with the Lord, and before he was with Israel out in the wilderness, he was a violent man. He had a hot temper because he had not spent the time with the Lord. Notice Exodus 2 and verses 11 and 12. Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Let me ask you, did Moses have a violent temper? He most certainly did. He arose and he killed this Egyptian, which was beating up one of his kin. In other words, one of his, the people that belonged to his nation. You see, Moses in Egypt, being surrounded by the glory and by the power and by the fame of Egypt, had assimilated the ideas and attitudes of Egypt. And the life of Moses can be divided into 3 equal 40-year segments. The first 40 years when he assimilated the culture of Egypt and he reflected Egypt. The second 40 years where he spent with the Lord in Midian, taking care of Jethro's sheep. And there he spent time with God in the mountain, and he became the meekest man on earth. And then 40 years in the wilderness, tending God's spiritual sheep, Israel, where he manifested that experience that he had with God. He manifested God's character in his life. Let me ask you, was Moses patient during those 40 years in the wilderness? You know, one of the most marvelous stories that I find in the whole Bible is the story of Moses. As he led the children of Israel through the desert to the promised land. I mean, these people were whining and complaining all the time. I probably would have lost my temper in the first day. But Moses didn't. For 40 years, whenever Israel complained, he said, okay, well, let me consult with the Lord. Listen, he was even willing to give up his life in order to save Israel, the Bible says, on Mount Sinai. So Moses had had a transformation in his life. It's because he had spent time with God those 40 years on Mount Horeb, because he had assimilated the character of God. In other words, the character of God had rubbed off on Moses, if you please. But do you know, as I mentioned, Moses was actually a foreshadowing of one greater than Moses. In other words, Moses actually represented someone who was far greater, who would come in the future, and that person is none other than Jesus Christ. Notice John chapter 1 and verse 14. John chapter 1 and verse 14. Here we find the one greater than Moses. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld His what? We beheld His glory. The glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. What was the glory of Jesus? It was His what? His grace and His truth. Are those character traits of God? They most certainly are. So what did Jesus come to reflect to the world? Jesus came to reflect to the world His what? His glory, which is His grace and His truth.